Hello and welcome to Grimwolf Workshop. I'm Alex, and in this episode I'll be introducing you to a technique known as glazing. Now, glazing is sometimes seen as a little bit of an advanced painting technique, and I'll show you that it needn't necessarily be that way, and sometimes can be used to speed up your painting and with better results than some of the so-called beginner techniques that are out there. Now I'll hand you over to our old friend Mr. Grim, the stop motion wolfman.
Right, let's not muck about. We'll show you how to get results like these on all 4 miniatures in just over 5 hours without relying on brand new fandangled techniques or just slapping a load of contrast paint on. Roll credits. We're using a tweaked Sons of the Storm scheme, which is an off-white Stormtrooper style armour paired with a vibrant magenta accent instead of the standard maroon, which is the change I'm going to make. Today I'm mainly using P3 paints. Their high pigment and thin consistency make them brilliant for glazes, though I will be keeping a little Vallejo glaze medium nearby just in case they need thinning ever so slightly. Before we go any further, if you enjoy these painting guides, please drop a like and subscribe, comment and share. It all helps us out, thank you very much. We'll start with the flesh tones, adding a tiny drop of glaze medium just to get the right consistency, and there's only 2 characters with exposed faces, so there should be a quick straightforward step applying light thin layers. These miniatures were pre-primed with a multicoloured zenithal highlight starting with a blue-grey base, a light pale blue mid-tone and a pure white peak. The zenithal undercoat does most of the heavy lifting. By glazing highly pigmented paint over the top, we tint the undercoat rather than covering it up. This creates instant mood and depth. To tie into the Sons of the Storm scheme, we're using a teal for the flowing cloaks. This is one of my favourite colours and blends smoothly into that blue-grey underpaint. Keep your brush strokes flowing in the same direction and maintain a smooth finish. And remember, you're just kind of licking the surface. You may have noticed that my thumbnail is starting to become covered in paint. This is a safety measure that I usually use before applying the paint to the miniature itself. Remember, always test your paint's opacity and viscosity on your thumbnail. If it shrinks, it's too thin. If it completely hides the surface below, it's too thick. The warband leader carries a lantern, so we're building on the object source lighting or OSL established during the priming stage. OSL simply creates the illusion of light emanating from a specific object onto surrounding surface areas. The lantern light spreads across the front of the miniature, so we'll keep our cloak glazes subtle nearby to preserve that warm yellow glow. Notice how I avoid touching the brightest yellow areas on the cloak folds. Glazing teal nearby subtly tints the transition to green, creating a smooth blend into the main cloak colour. I will be creating a more specific and in-depth OSL tutorial video later. I'll also leave in the description links to both my chromatic and multicoloured zenithal priming tutorials. The eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed battle damage on this particular miniature. Stormcast Eternals are the Age of Sigmar equivalent of their close cousins, the Space Marines or the Astartes. Therefore, they're in every single major Age of Sigmar box release. This means that there's an abundance of second-hand Stormcast Eternals available on places like eBay at decent prices second-hand. But unfortunately, sometimes they come with a little bit of scarring and damage. That doesn't mean that you can't still work with them. This set in particular had also previously been paint stripped, and this damage had not been noticed in the process. Looks to me like it's possibly glue that's been spilt on the miniature as it's been assembled. Moving on with the paint job, we are now applying Reichland Flesh Shade to the recesses on the skin sections of both miniatures with exposed faces. This is just to bring a little bit of depth, and then we'll move on to the next stage. Personally, I like to refer back to whatever piece of art or box I'm using to reference the colour scheme that I'm trying to achieve, and here I think the next colour that we will try and tackle is the gold. For the gold and the trim, we're using Army Painter's Hoplite Gold. It's a speed paint. Metallic speed paints work brilliantly as thinned glaze bases before coming back later with traditional metallics for your highlights. Hoplite's Gold is a particular personal favourite. It's got a kind of off greeny, almost tarnished look to it, but it's great as a good base that you can brighten up later with a nice shining pure metallic. As previously mentioned, rather than using a standard deep maroon accent, I'm swapping it to a magenta pinky purple. Now, despite what I said in the introduction, this is a contrast paint, one of several that we will be using. Contrast paints can be extremely good for glazing miniatures, however we will not be relying on them. There are several other reasons I've chosen this colour change. One, I genuinely like pink. Here's me when I had hair, as proof. Another reason is that I wanted to highlight the fact that it's perfectly okay to change even an official colour scheme. Remember the golden rule, these are your toy soldiers and you can do whatever the hell you want with them. And finally, it'll brighten the squad up and contrast brilliantly against the teal. I'm applying this pink uniformly across all models, on the hammer handles, scabbards, chainmail for the leader, and this will help to balance out that contrast not only with the teal but from that nice bright lantern yellow glow. The tracking hawk in this warband skips the pink, instead we're adding subtle detail into the feather recesses and tail using controlled strokes of Reichland flesh shade, and we'll also add a little bit of uniformity with the rest of the squad by using that teal on several of the feathers just to unify them as a squad. While the Reichland flesh shade is out and still wet on the wet palette, we will batch paint it into the recesses of the gold across all the miniatures who have gold. Batch processing like this keeps squad painting fast and cohesive. Remember, this is a speed paint session after all. And with this in mind, we'll also use the flesh shade to wash the tree stump scenic base on the bird miniature before moving on to our leather and wood details. And also bear in mind that when we are using ink washes like this, we're not slapping it all over, we're merely placing it into the recesses where it's needed rather than saturating the entire area. For the wood, bark and base terrain, we'll also build up depth using a combination later of a Thonian camo shade and a Grax earth shade. We're also going to be using my favourite contrast paint of all time, which is Plague Bearer Flesh, to create moss and grass style effects. It's extremely versatile and works very well for this type of painting. Sticking to the P3 paints that are coming out of this particular set, we're using Traitor's Green for the leather and wooden elements on these miniatures. Because it's a slightly off green brown, we will be able to create better wood and both leather effects by simply putting a wash over them later. Here we're finding all of the suitable parts of the miniature that can be used as leather or rope or straps, and we'll do this on every single one of these miniatures. I know the leader has got a rope around the back of her belt and some straps on the armour. We'll begin building up some of the depth on the scenic bases by using the Athonian camo shade that I mentioned earlier and some random sporadic patches on that tree stump. Then we will layer this with a Grax earth shade and the Plague Bearer Flesh. So as you can see, it can just go onto random sporadic areas, doesn't have to go into every single recess, and we will be using this Grax earth shade on the wooden areas and leather on our other miniatures as well, just to add a little bit of depth to the recesses. Without making them look too pale, we'll glaze a pure red Vallejo ink that's thinned ever so slightly with glaze medium directly into the deepest recesses on the bow, on the scale, on the grip for the hammer, and it'll make it just look ever so slightly less Barbie pink. Now we'll restore some vibrancy to the gold using Army Painter Greedy Gold on the raised edges, keeping the shade areas dark. And as with highlights on any zenithal highlighted miniature, I would recommend that rather than using the old heavy metal style of highlighting, where you just pick out every single edge. You concentrate your raised highlighting on the areas where the light falls on the zenith, making the light look natural and realistic. And what's more, this is going to save you a hell of a lot of time, because the majority of your highlights are going to fall on one side of the miniature rather than having to find them everywhere. Following suit with a bright gold, we're going to pick out the very top of those highlights just to give them that extra little bit of sheen. And carrying on from what I mentioned earlier, it's staying in that zenith. As you may have noticed on the leader's shoulder pad, I virtually did not highlight the back of the pad at all, as it fell into the shadow. Once again, this is more realistic, and frankly, we don't want to break the effect that we've spent hard time and effort creating by using the zenith in the first place. And here it is, the old faithful, finally time for my plague bearer flesh. Love it. We will use this on the bases, as mentioned before. We can be a little bit dirty and a little bit more slapdash with that. Just create some nice mossy, grassy, dirty grime effects. For the armour, I opted for a cool off-grey rather than pure white. This fits the low light ambience that we've already created with the zenith and gives us room to push crisp edge highlights where the light strikes, so it's not quite 100% Stormtrooper. And aside from picking out normal edges, there will be areas of the armour, such as these plates here on his leg, that are larger, more flat surfaces. So you want to apply smooth unidirectional brush strokes along the armour edges to simulate light creeping across the plates. This shoulder pad here is a particularly good example of how we have deliberately not highlighted certain parts of the miniature, because the back of this shoulder pad is in shadow, so it would not only break the effect, but it would look unrealistic in comparison to the rest of the paint job. And you can see this similarly on the edges of his bracers and his gauntlets. This is a technique that we're going to be carrying on into this miniature, the leader. As you can see, we are just picking out and building up slowly the edges of these highlights and allowing them to remain more or less grey as the shadow begins to form. But every time we go over the edge with that white again, we're going to make the bright parts where the light is hitting ever so slightly brighter and whiter each time. Here we'll refine them ever so slightly and make sure that these tiny little details, in particular on the boots and things, are only on one side of the miniature. Time for some teal highlights, and we're going with a nice bright pastel blue from AK-47, or AK Interactive I should say. Now this is quite a light blue in comparison to the teal that we've used as a base, in particular considering that teal, although quite light to start with, went over some dark shadows on that zenithal priming. But it's very important to remember that you should not be afraid of high contrast when it comes to some of your highlights, as this is what creates dynamic lighting. And as you can see, despite the fact that this is quite a light highlight in comparison, it accentuates that light on those raised surfaces and it blends quite nicely, as long as you make sure that your brush strokes are even in the same way that we have been doing throughout this paint job, and always in the same direction. You should avoid streaky lines, provided that you've thinned your paint to the right opacity as well, as we showed you at the beginning. This is some gunmetal grey that we are simply blocking out all of the metal areas with for treatment later. We are fast approaching the dotting the I's and crossing the T's phase of this paint job, so we're starting with some skeleton horde. This is just to give some more depth and detail on the hawk miniature, followed by a Nuln oil wash all over our metal areas. We're also going to use the Nuln oil to accentuate the shadows on the scenic bases and a few other areas where we need it to look a tiny bit darker than it already is doing, but it's mainly going to be the bases. We'll then pick out a few more extra details for highlights that we may have missed, or ones that we just want to accentuate a little bit further, using a tiny bit of pure white on the armour and certain parts of the cloak. And the scabbard. and then a little bit of Nilox oxide, which makes a great rust effect on metal, but also a great weathered effect for bricks. We now have an unthinned Vallejo yellow ink, carefully applied in thin layers to finish off the beak and talons on the hawk. We'll now make the metallics pop with a little bit of shining silver on the edges, just so they don't look dull and grey. A light dry brush of ghoulish grey over the stonework, little parts of the tree stump, and the hawk will help tie in all the environmental elements together. To wrap up, we paint the base rims in a clean, deep red brown and apply Games Workshop's technical hard coat varnish selectively over the armour to give it a protective and subtle shine. And then we're done. As previously mentioned, these are second-hand miniatures, and there's a little bit of a learning opportunity here as I've missed something. When I paint stripped these miniatures, I could have taken the time to examine them a little bit more closely, and I would have seen this bubbling on the back of this particular miniature's cloak. I could have filed this down before applying the multicoloured zenithal highlight, and it would have made the paint job look a little bit more smooth through the whole process. And I could, if I wanted to, go back, paint strip it again, but recreating the entire paint job in the same way using the same paints is not impossible but difficult. So the lesson is plan ahead better. All this said, the results did come in roughly just under 5 hours, and I'm very happy with them, so let's have a proper look at them.